After I exposed grooming gang secrets from Keir Starmer's time at the CPS, you told me to keep going.
Tell us the truth about grooming gangs, Prime Minister!
Well, I kept digging, and I found something explosive.
We had the fetus. She was treated as a commodity. The CPS refused to apologise for using it. They actually tried to justify the decisions made at the top by trying to portray her as a paedophile. A legal, tactical decision to add her to the indictment as one of the gang of paedophiles. That was a complete lie. It's wicked beyond belief.
Rochdale, ultimately successful prosecution.
And that man became Prime Minister.
I've always laid the blame at the door of Keir Starmer. I don't trust him. He is compromised.
Back in 2017, the UK was shaken to the core by the horrors shown in the BBC drama Three Girls, based on the true story of the Rochdale grooming gang. It tells the story of how three girls, Holly, Amber and Ruby, were not only abused by a gang of Pakistani paedophiles, they were also let down for years by everyone who was supposed to protect them. The drama ends with the perpetrators finally being brought to justice, and in the years since the show was broadcast, the idea that the Rochdale scandal ultimately ended with a success has grown. Without doubt, the most prominent figure to push this story is our current Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, who claims to have personally played a role in the so-called triumph.
I oversaw the first grooming gang prosecution, which was in Rochdale more than a decade ago. I was the prosecutor that brought the first case. And when that file was brought to my attention, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that one of the defendants had not been prosecuted previously. Far from covering up, I asked for that file so that I could have a look at it. On the back of that, I then changed the entire approach to prosecutions, which was then lauded by the government. We were doing the right thing. One of the things we did in light of the Rochdale ultimately successful prosecution was to walk through the decision-making from start to finish, from when the case first came to us. And then after that, to gather together other cases we've got throughout the organisation. We've also tried to encourage the police to come to us early, so that although we've got no power of direction over them, we can ask them to look at certain lines of investigation, rather than waiting, as happened in fact in the Rochdale case, to the very end of the police investigation, at the end of perhaps a single allegation, a file comes to us months after the event.
We wanted to know whether Rochdale actually was the success that Starmer claims, so we started digging. And that took us to the door of whistleblower police officer Maggie Oliver, the detective who knew the case and two of the three girls, Amber and Ruby, better than anyone else involved. I wanted to speak about Keir Starmer and his role in the Rochdale case. So he has consistently said that he played a key role in it. I think I've pulled some of the quotes from when he appeared before a select committee in 2012, where he said that he walked through the decision-making from start to finish. And then as recently as April 2025, he said he oversaw the first grooming gang prosecution, which was Rochdale, and that he was the first prosecutor who brought the first case. Now, you understand that case probably better than anyone else. Can you explain some of the decisions that he made?
I resigned from the police because of the decisions that were made on Rochdale. And I've spent 13 years talking about what happened. And I've always laid the blame firmly at the door of Keir Starmer as the Director of Public Prosecutions at that time. But until I'd seen the documents you've shown me, I didn't know that he was openly claiming credit for the decisions made, because the decisions made on that job went against absolutely everything that I believed in as a police officer. You know, upholding the law, acting with integrity. The decisions were just impossible to understand, and I will never condone them. It's a really complicated case, and we started off at the beginning of that case with about 36 victims. Ultimately, it was filtered down to a very small number. But when I was asked to go on that job, it was in late 2010, and I was asked to bring on board, amongst others, but 2 key victims. And I'm going to use the names that they were called in the BBC drama, 3 Girls, because if anybody wants to clarify their experiences, you can watch the drama again. The first girl that I would mention was Amber. Now, when I went on that case, Amber had already been identified as one of the key witnesses in that case, but she had previously, 2 years before, been arrested. And so before I was allowed to go and speak to her, the top lawyer in the CPS that was called John Lord, he headed up the complex case unit, had to look at the reason why she was arrested and decide whether it was justified, whether she actually was an offender or she was a victim. I joined that job in December, and in February 2011, John Lord officially and formally acknowledged that she was a victim. And as such, we were to interview her and prosecute all her rapists. Now, I know that there were well in excess of 20 men who had raped her. That was the tip of the iceberg. And I spent, after that permission was given, to try to gain Amber's trust and to give her an opportunity to talk about all the abuse she suffered. I spent about 6 months, pretty much daily visits, and taking her to do video interviews, identifying premises where the abuse happened, naming all those men who raped her. She went to ID parades and identified many of them. She was seen as one of the key victims in that case. About 6 months later, out of nowhere, I was told that the CPS had decided that they were no longer going to use Amber.
And you've got these aren't just your words.
These are not my words.
You've got actual hard evidence in a review of the case that goes through this and spells it out, exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, Amber was acknowledged as a victim. I was given permission to speak to her, to interview her, in which she told me everything that had happened to her. She was then dropped as a victim. Now, it took me from the end of 2012 until this independent report was published in January 2024. And in this report, it talks about the indictment of Amber and the role of the CPS. So in January 2011, Amber was considered a critical witness to the successful outcome of OPSPAN. It was known she had previously been arrested. Then, in February 2011, the head of the complex case unit at the CPS formally agreed that Amber would be designated as a victim. She should never have been arrested in 2009. Following that decision, I was tasked to befriend Amber and her family, win her confidence to give evidence to the inquiry. Amber gave many hours of interviews. Amber's evidence was likely to expand the investigation beyond that which the dedicated resources would allow. We believe, this is the review team, that this was the case. We note that GMP has since acknowledged that none of Amber's evidence was entered as crimes against her on the police system, and it did not form part of the forthcoming Operation Span trial.
They are saying that the evidence that she gave, if I've understood this correctly, opened the case up.
Yes.
And made it much, much bigger than what they were willing to commit resources to prosecute.
Yeah. And I saw that by the way the atmosphere within the investigation began to change over months. So rather than having this report says that there were well over 70 victims, the OPSPAN trial, in the end, I think had 4 victims. Every other victim was cast to the wind, including Amber. And Amber had opened up this investigation by naming dozens of men who had not only raped her, but raped other children. There was one document that contained all their names, all their phone numbers, where they worked. That document was known as Document 29. When it was recognised that Amber's evidence was going to really make this a very long-term, long-standing investigation to get through it all, in my opinion, what they did, they decided we're going to block her out, we're going to drop her.
Well, it says there in...
It says
well,
there. When I've seen this, 3 years ago, when I was on that job, it made no sense to me. But I could see that there was a real determination to distance Amber, to make her walk away. And it never made any sense initially, but I knew that what was happening was wrong. This document officially corroborates what I knew to be the case back then. So they dropped Amber. Nobody went anywhere near her for about a year after I walked off that job. And actually the investigation team were very happy about that. But subsequently, when the barristers and probably Keir Starmer, if he was, overseeing every decision.
Walked through the decision making from start to finish.
Absolutely. So what happened, and I have no doubt that this is the truth, what happened was subsequently when the case is ready to proceed, Keir Starmer, the barrister, realised that they need Amber in that trial, or that trial wouldn't have run, because so many of the lines of inquiry came from Amber. And at that point, how are they going to bring back in a victim when you're a few weeks from trial? So what they did, and I've got it in writing that it was a tactical option, they decided that the only way to get Amber's evidence into court was to add her to the indictment as one of the gang of paedophiles. But they didn't arrest Amber. They didn't tell her what they were going to do. They never cautioned her. And in fact, she didn't even know that she was being portrayed in that trial as an older madam who was procuring children for the gang. That was a complete lie. And if you think back, the head of the complex case unit had officially acknowledged and determined that Amber was a victim. This document proves that she was a victim, because 10 years later, they decided once again that she is a victim. Now all her rapes have been recorded and she has been publicly acknowledged as the victim that she always was. But the CPS, Keir Starmer, Nazir Assel, decided that they would add her onto the indictment as one of the abusers just to get her evidence into court. And this report goes on to say here that it became, this is what it says, in September 2011, it became apparent that the evidence held by Amber was critical to the successful prosecution of Operation Span. A legal, tactical decision to ensure the jury heard Amber's critical evidence in the case was made. This was despite previous commitments provided to Amber in the full knowledge that she had been coerced by her abusers. Amber was not informed that she would be named on the court indictment, and she was unable at any stage of the procedure to defend herself against these allegations. We can find no evidence to indicate any consideration was given to how the decision would affect Amber. This has had a long-term damaging impact on her welfare, and we regard this as a deplorable further abuse of a CSE survivor. Now, in 2022, the Chief Constable of GMP issued Amber with a public apology for failing to investigate the crimes against her and failing to recognise her as a child victim. She was treated as a commodity. And further to that, they actually tried to justify the decisions made at the top by going after her children, by trying to portray her as a paedophile. She had a little baby just before I resigned from the police. And when she gave birth, the police and social services lied and said that there was a court order preventing Amber from taking that baby home. And so the baby was tagged in the maternity ward, and it took the matron to, after 3 days, demand the court order. There was not a court order. And I then went, the timing was, that's when I resigned. I went back to see Amber to tell her that she'd been put on the indictment, and suddenly she understood why her babies were being taken away from. They were never taken away because the judge threw it all out. But the depths that people like Nazir Afzal, like the barrister, like Keir Starmer went to in order to justify a decision that was always inhumane and actually legally wrong, shocked me then, and it shocks me now. And there is no excuse for what was done to that girl. You know, without my involvement, she would have lived the rest of her life under a cloud of having been named a paedophile, when in actual fact, she was a victim of the most horrific abuse that GMP targeted through me because we knew she was a victim. And, you know, it's wicked beyond belief, but it also undermines everything that I believe anyone is entitled to in this country today. You know, even the Yorkshire Ripper was arrested. He was cautioned. He had legal representation and he was able to defend himself. This kid, this child, had no knowledge of what was being said about her. You know, you are innocent until proven guilty. And yet, the reason they didn't do that, they did all this secretly, was because they knew that any lawyer worth their salt would have had this thrown out at the first hurdle. But they didn't dare do that because the whole case would have collapsed. So they decided that she was, you know, it was justified to throw her under the bus because they'd actually messed up. And it, you know, for somebody to be the Director of Public Prosecutions and approve those kinds of decisions and disregard a vulnerable victim like this, for me, paints a picture of somebody who doesn't care about victims.
So, in terms of your characterisation of the cases, the girls are being treated as commodities, tactical options, besmirch, you know, their names besmirched, their children potentially taken by social services. Nazir Afzal stands up at the same evidence and says, and this is quite a crucial line, what the director, Keir Starmer, has tasked me with is to ensure whatever good practice we have developed around Rochdale and the child sexual exploitation in the Northwest is rolled out and used everywhere.
That's horrific. And I think it's relevant to say that I spent 10 years, more than 10 years, fighting alongside Amber to have her reputation restored, to have all her crimes against her as a rape victim recorded. One of the things that we did, we took action against Greater Manchester Police, and it says there the Chief Constable apologised. He acknowledged that she was a victim. He actually said that this case was borderline incompetent. We also took action against the CPS. And I went to meetings in London with the CPS, highlighting that the use of this tactical option against a vulnerable victim of horrendous abuse was inhumane, it was unlawful, and it should never be used. The CPS refused to apologise for using it. They refused to say they won't use it again. And we still have never had an acknowledgement that they've outlawed this practice. So I know about Amber because I worked on this case. I don't know about how many other children have had this same tactic used against them. You know, I was made aware of this decision in my grievance response, and it said this is highly confidential. Without that sentence about the tactical option being in my grievance response, I would never have known what had been done. So the question has to be asked when you're saying that Nazir Afzal is saying that this is good practice, why will the CPS not say it's no longer going to be used? And how can you justify something that, in my opinion, is so horrendous that it goes against everything that the criminal justice system should stand for?
And I think there's another point, which is the only reason that we know Keir Starmer's involvement is because he's told us, because he said it.
Yeah.
If he hadn't said it, there would be no way to tie him this to him, because everything that we're talking about is legally sensitive until it appears in a report like you're describing, or until it is in evidence like this. We just don't know. And that man became Prime Minister. And I think, so I had a look at how he rose and he came into politics. And he left the CPS and almost immediately was courted by the Labour Party, started kind of making inroads in terms of becoming an MP. And so part of that was that they brought him on a kind of justice panel. He talks about Rochdale from the start. So obviously everyone's heard the smash the gangs, all of this type of stuff. But from the start, he said, and I think in light of what you said, it's interesting just to read back this quote from this article from December 2013, where he says, the more vulnerable you are as a victim or a witness, the less able the criminal law is to protect you. We saw this as we unpicked the child abuse cases, both the Rochdale grooming cases, but also the Savile cases. What do you think of that?
None of this surprises me at all. I've always believed that he was at the helm of this decision making. I've said before, I'm not a party political person, but to have somebody with the empathy, with the humanity, like that man leading the country, but more than that, now overseeing this new inquiry, how can anybody trust anything that he says or does? And I am fearful for the welfare of the victims who put their hope in another inquiry, only to have those hopes betrayed. And I think back to last year, and the first part one of this so-called new inquiry, and all the shambolic treatment, the shambolic behaviour, but the horrendous treatment of victims and survivors, like Eliane or Fiona or Elizabeth. Victims were being played off against each other. And actually, that's pretty much what happened in Rochdale, actually. He decided who were the good victims and who were the bad victims, and threw the bad victims to the wolves because it wasn't convenient to have this job grow into what it should actually have been. I always believed that. That's why I left the police. But to actually own it and talk about it as though it's a great success is pretty damning.
You know what's so interesting, actually? I was just thinking, as you spoke there, which is, he talks about the vulnerable people not being able to access the law and unpicking the Rochdale case. What he's saying is true. He's just not talking about his role within that.
I mean, somebody like a child like Amber was recognised as vulnerable from day one. Her score on the vulnerability chart was through the roof. She'd already been arrested when she shouldn't have been arrested. I was tasked with going to gain her trust with commitments that if she shared with me and with GMP what had happened to her, that she would be supported right through the process to court. She was no longer being abused. She was trying to get on with her life with her little family. And to her everlasting credit, she agreed to help us in order to stop her abusers from abusing more children. For her then to be just thrown under a bus without the slightest regard for what she'd put herself through and what our commitments were to her, it is unacceptable in a civilised country, and should never have happened. And that's why we have victims now being fearful of trusting the police, of trusting the establishment, because we've seen these things happening again and again. But what I saw happening in this case, under the leadership of Keir Starmer, Nazir Afzal, Peter Farry, who was the Chief Constable, I only know it in the depth. I know it because I worked in it. But I would bet my life on it that these are not isolated decisions around just one child. These decisions are being portrayed as successful. Who's measuring the success? And what are they using in order to decide who they're going to destroy and who they're not? A victim is a victim. And this is why we've got the problem we've got in this country with grooming gangs, because the real offenders know that the establishment is actually covering up for them. That it's about, you've got as much chance of being caught as you have of finding a needle in a haystack. And it's this kind of decision making from the top which has sent out that clear message, and why we're in the mess we're in.
Okay, well, I want to talk about Adil Khan. Crimes that he was charged with, what member of the Rochdale grooming gang. He was charged with trafficking for sexual exploitation and conspiracy to engage in sexual activity with children. Now, that decision, you've got information about why that is actually quite ludicrous that he was charged with those and not a more serious offence such as rape.
Yeah, I mean, when I joined the Rochdale case, Amber and Ruby, I'm using the names from the drama, were sisters. In 2009, when she was just 13, he made her pregnant and she went for a termination. Without her consent or knowledge, the police and social services turned up at that termination when she was having the abortion, didn't tell her mum, they didn't tell Ruby, but they seized the fetus for potential DNA evidence. They put it in a freezer and did nothing with it. About a year and a half later, it was found in a routine property review. Ruby was in a special school. She had a statement of special educational needs, and even in early documents that, you know, I've still got, some paperwork that I've got, it says that Ruby is a victim of rape and other very serious sexual offences. When I went on the Rochdale job, one of my key tasks was to tell Ruby and to tell her mum that GMP had retained this fetus, which was incredibly traumatising for Ruby. The second part of what I was asked to do was to then get her consent for us to take DNA from that fetus to identify who had made her pregnant. And again, to her everlasting credit, she agreed to do that, even though she still saw herself as being, she had been in a relationship with this 43-year-old married man of 3, because she was such a vulnerable child. But she gave her consent. So we knew that Adil Khan, his street name was Billy, we knew that he was responsible for that pregnancy, and we had the fetus. So imagine my shock and horror to find out that even he was not going to be charged with rape. You know, he was charged with conspiracy to commit sexual activity with a child. How can you conspire when you've made a little girl of 13 pregnant? It's not a conspiracy. You've got the physical evidence. We had more evidence than you would have in 99% of alleged rapes. We had a child who had a statement of special educational needs. She was going to a special school. She was extremely vulnerable. We had a fetus and we knew he was responsible. So that decision was, it went against everything that I believe the law was there to do. And more than that, these children were being made, they were being exploited, but in order to deaden the pain, they were taking loads of alcohol. So, you know, another factor was that she was constantly drunk, so couldn't give consent. And yet, you know, the CPS, Keir Starmer, if he's overseeing all these decisions, deliberately made the decision and the choice not to charge that man with rape. And to this day, I will never accept that that was the right decision. But it's another example of how they wanted to do a very quick fix on this job. Get in, get out, you know, draw a line under it. Forget about the 70-odd children that we knew were being raped. Let the rest of the gang, we had many, many more than were charged. I think 9 were charged in the end with a variety of minor offences. They used trafficking as one of the main charges. And, you know, from day one when I've been speaking out, I've always said that trafficking goes no way towards being adequate for the offending that these men were doing. You know, they weren't picking up a kid and taking him to the town next door to get him a pizza. Yeah, they might be trafficking them from Rochdale to Rotherham or to Bradford or to Telford, but they weren't doing it just to give them a ride in a car. They were doing it to rape them. So the trafficking offence is a much easier offence to prove. So every decision that was made on this Rochdale case was done with the intention of getting rid of a job that was seen as a problem. It wasn't about putting away the paedophiles for horrendous abusing of multiple children, dozens, if not hundreds. You know, they were allowed to do this for many years. And Adil Khan got a slap on the wrist. He was out of prison in less than 4 years.
I'm not a police officer. I'm not a barrister. But I think I would be, like most people would agree, a fetus with DNA for a child seems like a straightforward thing to prove. You're a former police officer. Am I wrong?
No, I would have thrown the book at this man. You know, I would have charged him with rape. I would have charged him with sexual activity with a child. I would have thrown everything at him. But there was undue haste to get this job from opening it up to a trial. I think from the day I walked onto that job in December 2010, the trial was about not even 18 months later. I don't think I ever worked on any major incidents where it was that speedy a resolution. And I think it was driven, you know, they say more haste, less speed, and it just was not carried out efficiently, effectively. And the welfare of the children who had been abused by these men was not even an afterthought.
Well, I think there is a hasty prosecution. They then go pretty quickly to the MPs and tell them what a good job that they've done.
Yeah, it was the Home Office Select Committee, chaired by Keith Vaz. And, I mean, there's a story there as well. But by the time it went to, I spent not quite 18 months, but about 15 months as a serving police officer. When I knew what was going on, naively, I didn't know any of this back then. I just knew that it was wrong. And I knew that as a police officer, it went against everything that I believed in. You know, I'd given 16 years of my life to this job, and I believed that the law was there to protect children. And initially, I thought it was one lazy officer who just couldn't be bothered with doing a proper job. So I tried for 15 months to go to all the ranks within the police. I went to the head of public protection, the head of serious crime, the chief constable, Peter Fye. Nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. And ultimately I was told by another senior officer, well, first of all, I thought I would go to prison because I was told that what I knew, I only knew because I was a serving police officer. But it was such a horrific neglect of duty to me that I felt that I had to go public. So I resigned, and in October 2012, I went back to see Amber in the November, which was when I found, because I was then able to tell her that she'd been added to the indictment, which she still didn't know. And then I knew that this Home Affairs Select Committee was going to be looking at this Rochdale case. And so I contacted the Home Office and I asked to go and give evidence. And I was not allowed to give evidence because, again, they paraded out the people who were going to say what a fantastic job this was.
I'm interested for what it's like to, as a police officer, it says there in that report that you had to get Amber on board.
Yeah.
You had to you had to first tell Ruby about this fetus and then convince her for it to be used as evidence. And then all this gets thrown away. What's that like for you?
It still to this day is one of the most traumatic periods of my whole life. And I was ashamed of my role in gaining their trust. You know, I was headhunted for that job because of my skills with vulnerable people, but I wasn't misleading them. You know, I had been told from the top of GMP and shown all the policy documents to say, we need these children and we will support them to court if they tell us what's happened. So I was able to convince them that it was the right thing to do. But it wasn't because they wanted to prevent their own abuse. It was because they were beginning to see how they had been exploited and the damage that had caused to them, and they didn't want this to happen to other children. So to then feel that my role had caused them such horrendous consequences, it is abhorrent, really. I've spent the past 15 years trying to put it right, and they are both acknowledged as the victims they rightly were. You know, I've spent many good times with them over the years. I've helped them be publicly acknowledged as the victims that they are. But when you become a police officer, you promise to uphold the law and to act with integrity and uphold fundamental human rights. And it's a shame. Well, actually, no, it's not a shame. It's criminal that those at the top of our public institutions don't hold the same principles. And for anybody to be able to treat two vulnerable children in this way is very telling about them as people. And I don't know how they sleep in their beds at night.
I guess the one last question that I've got is, can Keir Starmer make any decision related to grooming gangs, or is he compromised? Is it a conflict of interest for him to be making any decisions related to this?
I don't trust him. And I think the decision making on this case, the decisions made, in my opinion, are so horrific that he is compromised. You know, if he's trying to say that this was, you know, the pinnacle of prosecution success, I think we've got exactly the opposite here. And there must be a conflict in wanting to conceal some of those decisions because they are horrific.
Maggie's revelations about the details of the files Starmer claims to have personally dealt with was shocking. But I had to know, what did the girls themselves think of all of this? So with Maggie's help, we arranged to speak to one of them, called Ruby.
So before they took the fetus, they should have had my consent. It's vile. That was a piece of me. Do you know what I mean? Like, that was a piece of me. That's like taking somebody's kidney without asking. It's vile. It's disgusting.